Trump's divide and conquer strategy is blowing up in his face, and it's all because of one crucial meeting in Mexico City. While Trump thought he could pit Canada and Mexico against each other in trade negotiations, Prime Minister Mark Carney just pulled off a diplomatic masterstroke that completely flipped the script. This isn't just about trade deals or tariffs. This is about two nations refusing to be bullied and instead choosing to build an alliance that could fundamentally change North American geopolitics. So what exactly happened in Mexico City, and why is Trump's strategy of playing allies against each other suddenly looking like a massive miscalculation? To understand what's really at stake here, we need to rewind to how we got to this point. For months, Trump has been wielding tariffs like a sledgehammer, trying to force both Canada and Mexico into submission through economic pressure. His strategy was simple: divide and conquer. Make each country compete for his favor while threatening to exclude the other from North American trade. The plan seemed to be working when Canadian provincial leaders like Doug Ford and Danielle Smith started suggesting that maybe Canada would be better off without Mexico in the trade deal. Trump was successfully driving a wedge between the two smaller North American partners, forcing them to scramble for his attention while he held all the cards.
They had a private meeting there on the sidelines of the summit, and it seemed to go pretty well. That was a sign that Canada was making progress of kind of repairing or smoothing over some relations with Mexico that may have gotten rattled in the early days of Trump's second presidency when he imposed those tariffs, the fentanyl tariffs, on both Canada and Mexico. And then Ontario Premier Doug Ford came out and suggested that Canada should essentially drop Mexico as a trading partner and focus on a negotiation with the United States between a sort of a bilateral negotiation, a two-way, and leave Mexico out of it. That obviously did not play very well with the Mexicans. They were not happy about that. And so Carney's been trying to kind of smooth that over
The tensions were real, and the diplomatic damage was mounting. Ontario Premier. Doug Ford's controversial suggestion that Canada should drop Mexico as a trading partner and negotiate bilaterally with the U.S. created serious friction between the two nations. This was exactly what Trump wanted, his neighbors fighting among themselves while he dictated terms. But here's where Trump's strategy started to unravel. Instead of continuing to fight each other for scraps from Washington's table, Carney made a calculated decision to do the exact opposite of what Trump wanted. He flew to Mexico City not to compete with Mexico for Trump's favor, but to build a partnership that could stand up to Trump's pressure together.
From reporters after meeting with top officials there to get a vital trade relationship back on track. Evan Dyer has been watching it all. So, Evan, can you bring us up to speed?
Adrian, the Canadian and Mexican leaders appear to have smoothed over the tensions that emerged following the election of Donald Trump when he succeeded in driving a wedge between the two countries with his tariff plans, causing some Canadian politicians to suggest that Mexico should be cut out of the CUSMA trade deal. These are two countries that face a common threat, and they seem to have decided they're stronger facing it together.
We are both undertaking massive transformations of our economy. Plan Mexico, Canada strong. Our efforts will be strengthened by working together.
Mexico and Canada want to do more on two fronts. First, work together to save North America-wide free trade by coordinating strategies for next year's review of CUSMA, the trade deal that replaced the original NAFTA 5 years ago.
How do we eliminate these tariffs that we both face prior to the end of the year so that we can have a fruitful discussion on the USMCA future beginning in 2026?
The two countries also have to cooperate without provoking the Trump administration.
So, going to be very careful to make sure that the visit is not portrayed as some kind of strategic meeting or ganging up in some way with the White House.
But both countries know they can't count on restoring normal trade with the U.S., and both are looking for new partners.
It's a chance for us to talk not just about the tariff dispute that's underway, but also are we going to be able to do to deepen our bilateral relationships with each other. We've spent way too much time ignoring each other. Now it's time to do more.
President Sheinbaum said she wanted to strengthen maritime trade with Canada. Mexico is in the middle of a huge renewal.
What happened next was remarkable. Prime Minister Trudeau had already been working behind the scenes to repair the damage, even inviting Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum to the G7 summit. This wasn't just diplomatic nicety, it was a clear signal that Canada was choosing cooperation over competition. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Just as the United States officially launched its review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, Carney was sitting down with Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum to sign what they're calling the Canada-Mexico Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. This isn't just a symbolic gesture.
Countries now are dealing with the fentanyl tariffs that Trump has imposed, as well as the additional tariffs, the so-called sectoral tariffs in the auto sector, in the steel and aluminum sector, softwood lumber in Canada, not so much an issue for the Mexicans. So there is kind of a common interest in here in working together and trying to solve those problems. But in the meantime, it looks like Carney and Sheinbaum are going to sign off on this agreement. Really not a trade agreement. It sounds more like an agreement to do certain things kind of in the security space. Maybe there is things they can do on mutual borders, kind of cooperation there to possibly appease Trump's sort of lingering concerns about fentanyl trafficking in North America in general.
Both countries face the same challenges: fentanyl tariffs, sectoral tariffs on auto, steel, aluminum, and softwood lumber. Rather than letting these shared pressures divide them, they've become the foundation for unprecedented cooperation. The agreement they're signing focuses heavily on security cooperation and border measures that could actually address Trump's stated concerns about fentanyl trafficking, but on their terms, not his. This is a comprehensive alliance covering trade, security, energy, and infrastructure that operates independently of whatever chaos Trump might unleash. Think about the strategic brilliance of this move. For months, Trump has been using the threat of excluding Mexico from CUSMA as leverage against both countries. He's been playing them against each other, hoping they'd compete to be his preferred partner. Instead, Carney just created a bilateral relationship that can survive whatever happens to the trilateral agreement. The scope of what Canada and Mexico agreed to is staggering. They're talking about building integrated supply chains, developing energy corridors, sharing security intelligence to combat drug trafficking, and creating investment opportunities worth billions of dollars. This isn't just about trade, it's about building a parallel North American partnership that doesn't depend on Trump's whims. But what makes this even more damaging to Trump's strategy is the timing and the optics. While Trump has been desperately trying to get Mexico to pay for increased border security and fentanyl interdiction, Carney just announced $9.9 billion in funding for UN-led projects to support migrant integration in Mexico and combat drug trafficking. Canada is essentially doing what Trump has been demanding Mexico do, but they're doing it as partners rather than under threat. The economic implications are massive. Mexico is already Canada's third largest trading partner, with $56 billion in bilateral trade last year. But that relationship has been largely transactional and limited by both countries' focus on their relationships with the United States. Now they're talking about expanding trade in energy, infrastructure, critical minerals, and agriculture, all sectors where they can reduce their dependence on the American market. Here's where Trump's miscalculation becomes crystal clear. He thought that by applying pressure to both countries simultaneously, he could force them to compete for his favor. Instead, he created the perfect incentive for them to work together. When you're being squeezed by the same bully, the logical response isn't to fight each other, it's to team up against the bully. The security cooperation aspect is particularly damaging to Trump's narrative. For months, he's been claiming that both Canada and Mexico are failing to stop the flow of drugs and migrants into the United States. Now, those two countries are creating a joint security dialogue specifically focused on transnational crime, drug trafficking, and human trafficking. They're essentially saying, fine, if the United States won't work with us constructively on these issues, we'll work with each other. But the real genius of Carney's strategy becomes apparent when you look at what this means for the upcoming CUSMA renegotiation. Trump has been counting on being able to play Canada and Mexico against each other during those negotiations. He wanted to be able to threaten each country with exclusion while promising the other preferential treatment. Now he's facing a unified front. When Canada and Mexico walk into those negotiations, they won't be competing with each other for Trump's favor. They'll be coordinating their positions, sharing information, and potentially even willing to walk away together if Trump's demands are too extreme. This completely changes the power dynamic. Instead of Trump being able to divide and conquer, he's now facing two countries that have alternative arrangements with each other. The economic leverage that came from being the dominant partner in a trilateral relationship suddenly looks a lot weaker when two of the three partners have built their own bilateral partnership. The energy sector cooperation is particularly strategic. Mexico has been looking to diversify its energy relationships beyond the United States, and Canada has massive energy resources that need new markets. By creating energy corridors and cooperation agreements, they're building infrastructure that reduces both countries' dependence on American energy markets and transit routes. This is exactly the kind of strategic diversification that Trump's trade wars were supposed to prevent. What's even more sophisticated about this partnership is how it addresses one of Trump's key pressure points. China. Both Canada and Mexico have been under intense pressure from Trump to align their China policies with American preferences. Instead of competing to show Trump who can be tougher on China, they're now coordinating their approaches. This means Trump can't play them against each other on China policy either. The infrastructure cooperation aspect reveals another dimension of how this partnership undermines Trump's strategy. Canada and Mexico are talking about developing port-to-port trade routes, rail connections, and integrated supply chains. This isn't just about current trade. It's about building the physical infrastructure for a North American economy that doesn't run through the United States. When you can ship goods directly between Canadian and Mexican ports, you're less dependent on American transportation networks and less vulnerable to American trade restrictions. Trump's response to this development has been telling. Instead of acknowledging that his divide and conquer strategy backfired, he's been trying to downplay the significance of the Canada-Mexico partnership. But the reality is that this represents a fundamental shift in North American geopolitics. For decades, both Canada and Mexico have oriented their foreign economic policies primarily around their relationships with the United States. Now they're building a significant partnership with each other that operates independently of American preferences. The timing of this partnership announcement, just as the CUSMA review process begins, sends a clear message to Washington. You can't take our cooperation for granted anymore. If the United States wants to maintain its dominant position in North American trade, it needs to offer something better than threats and ultimatums. The migration and security cooperation aspects of this partnership are particularly damaging to Trump's narrative. He spent months claiming that both countries are failing to address migration and drug trafficking issues. Now they're creating joint programs to address exactly those issues, but they're doing it together rather than under American direction. This makes it much harder for Trump to claim that only American pressure can solve these problems. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this partnership is what it represents for the future of North American integration. For decades, North American economic integration has been synonymous with American leadership. The assumption was that Canada and Mexico would always be junior partners orbiting around the American economy. This partnership suggests a different model, one where the smaller partners work together to balance American influence. And the agricultural cooperation component is particularly strategic. Canada has massive grain production capacity, and Mexico is a major food importer. By creating integrated agricultural supply chains, they're reducing Mexico's dependence on American food exports while creating new markets for Canadian farmers. This is exactly the kind of economic diversification that makes countries less vulnerable to trade wars. What makes this partnership even more powerful is that it's not just about economics. The climate and conservation cooperation aspects create shared interests that go beyond trade. When countries are working together on environmental protection, wildlife conservation, and climate change mitigation, they're building relationships that are much harder to disrupt with economic pressure. The critical minerals cooperation is particularly forward-looking. Both countries have significant mineral resources that are essential for the green energy transition. By coordinating their mining and processing capabilities, they're positioning themselves to be less dependent on American supply chains for the technologies of the future. This is strategic thinking that goes far beyond the current trade disputes. Trump's fundamental miscalculation was assuming that economic pressure would make countries more compliant rather than more creative about finding alternatives. By threatening both Canada and Mexico simultaneously, he created the perfect conditions for them to find common cause. Instead of competing for his favor, they're now competing to see who can be less dependent on the American market. The innovation and technology cooperation aspects of this partnership are particularly significant for the long term. When countries start sharing research and development resources, they're building capabilities that can challenge American technological dominance. This isn't just about current trade relationships, it's about building the foundation for future economic independence. What's particularly clever about the structure of this partnership is that it's designed to be resilient regardless of what happens with CUSMA. If the trilateral agreement survives and thrives, the bilateral partnership enhances it. If CUSMA gets torn up or significantly weakened, the bilateral partnership provides an alternative foundation for continued cooperation. This kind of strategic hedging is exactly what Trump's unpredictable approach to trade policy has encouraged. The security dialogue component addresses one of Trump's key concerns, transnational crime and drug trafficking, but it does so in a way that reduces rather than increases American influence. When Canada and Mexico are sharing intelligence and coordinating law enforcement activities directly with each other, they're less dependent on American security cooperation and less vulnerable to American security-related pressure. The energy infrastructure cooperation has the potential to be transformative. North American energy markets have historically been dominated by American companies and American infrastructure. When Canada and Mexico start building energy corridors that bypass American networks, they're creating alternatives that make the entire region less dependent on American energy infrastructure. This partnership also represents a sophisticated response to one of the key challenges of dealing with Trump, his unpredictability. Instead of trying to predict what he'll do next and plan accordingly, Canada and Mexico have created a framework that can adapt to whatever he does. If he becomes more cooperative, they can work with him. If he becomes more hostile, they have alternatives. The agricultural technology sharing aspects of this partnership could be particularly significant for global food security. Canada has advanced agricultural technology, and Mexico has diverse growing conditions. By combining their capabilities, they could become a major force in global agricultural markets that doesn't depend on American agricultural technology or American agricultural exports. What's most remarkable about this development is how it represents a complete reversal of Trump's intended strategy. He wanted to use economic pressure to make both countries more dependent on the American market and more compliant with American preferences. Instead, he's created the conditions for them to become more independent and more willing to chart their own course. The infrastructure development cooperation has the potential to reshape North American logistics. When Canada and Mexico start building integrated transportation networks, they're creating alternatives to American-dominated supply chains. This doesn't just affect current trade patterns, it creates new possibilities for how goods and services move around the continent. Trump's trade war strategy was based on the assumption that America's economic size and market access made it indispensable to its neighbors. This partnership suggests that assumption might be wrong. When two countries with combined GDP of over $3 trillion start working together systematically, they can create alternatives that reduce their dependence on any single partner, even one as large as the United States. The timing of this partnership, coming just as the CUSMA review process begins, sends a clear signal about the changed dynamics of North American trade. Instead of two smaller countries competing for access to the American market, Trump now faces two countries that have created their own significant market through cooperation. This fundamentally changes the negotiating dynamics for any future trade discussions. Thanks for watching. The Canada-Mexico partnership represents a fundamental shift in North American geopolitics that emerged directly from Trump's failed divide and conquer strategy. Instead of making both countries more dependent on American favor, his approach pushed them to find strength in each other. If you want to see how other countries are responding to American trade pressure and building alternative partnerships, check out our other videos. And if you want to stay updated on how these shifting global alliances are reshaping international trade and geopolitics, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth analysis.